As we hit the dead of the offseason, the Bulls roster more or less as a whole is a little more certain knowing what it's going to look like going into this upcoming season, but what's a bit more uncertain, and something we've talked a little bit about before, is the future of DeMar DeRozan on this team. Whether that be in the form of a trade, if the Bulls look to move him before his current contract expires this season and he becomes a free agent next offseason, or if the Bulls would in fact extend the six-time All-Star to avoid having him become an unrestricted free agent and locking him up for a longer-term deal. There is a lot of debate among Bulls fans on the path that should be taken, and it's almost led to DeMar becoming this polarizing figure amongst Bulls Nation between those who think we absolutely should keep DeMar, who feel that he's the Bulls' best player and that this team would be even worse without him, to those who think he needs to be traded ASAP as they feel this team would be much better with him off of it. Well, in today's video, rather than focusing on the trade piece aspect of it, we're going to be discussing whether the Bulls should in fact extend DeMar DeRozan and keep him around long term. What would the benefits be? What would the alternatives be? And of course, I'll give my thoughts on what I actually think will happen. So what's going on, everyone? You're listening to Bulls Central here. Hope you're all doing well. Now, just a quick background. I'm sure most of you already know this, but in the 2021 offseason, the Bulls signed DeMar DeRozan by way of a sign-and trade where they sent Thaddeus Young and Al-Farouq Amino, basically salary filler, and a first-round pick in 2025, top 10 protected, to the Spurs to acquire DeRozan in the form of a 3-year, $82 million deal. And at that time, most people thought the Bulls were nuts for not only offering that large of a contract to DeRozan, who was 31 at the time, but also trading a first-round pick to get him. Like, as good as DeMar was, no one was going to be offering him anywhere close to that level of a contract at his age while still playing well. You had to think this was going to be somewhat of a decline for him going into his mid-30s. But sure enough, DeMar would actually go on to have one of his best seasons of his career in that first year with the Bulls, putting up insane numbers on ridiculous efficiency, breaking records that had previously only been set by Wilt Chamberlain for efficiency and scoring over 35 points per game in consecutive games. For a while, he was one of the leaders in the MVP race as well, ultimately finished the season as an all-star starter and selected to an all-NBA team. Safe to say, DeMar put all of the haters and doubters to shame, and proving that despite not being this high-level three-point shooter, you could still get the job done operating in the mid-range where he plays his best. Fast forward to next season though, while DeMar still played at a high level and was clearly one of the Bulls' best players on most nights, he wasn't putting on the kind of clinic we saw the prior season, and of course it didn't help that the Bulls struggled as a team and missed the playoffs, in large part due to their lack of three-point shooting being well behind the league in overall threes taken. DeMar still managed to make an all-star team though, although a lot of people felt that was a bit of a stretch, especially considering the Bulls' record, but it was becoming more and more clear that as good as DeMar had been, his overall style of play wasn't conducive to the Bulls' need for a high-octane pace and space offense that they like to run and do so well at when they're playing quickly in transition and getting downhill off of turnovers. DeMar, as you know, prefers to play in the half court, slow the pace down, handle the ball, create his shots, and get to his spot in isolation, which, yeah, sometimes works, and it's great when you're one of the best mid-range players in the game and those shots are falling. But when they're not falling, it becomes a problem. But anyway, that long-winded background, all of that to say that DeMar, 34 years old now, he actually just had a birthday, has one final year left on his deal with the Bulls. So it begs the question, should the Bulls extend DeMar since he's extension eligible and regardless of his flaws is still one of the best players, if not the best, and one of the team's veteran leaders on this team. So here's my perspective on all of this, because I've seen some people say, not a lot, but some, well, extending DeMar sure probably isn't the best decision, but there really isn't a better option. And the Bulls are going to be forced to extend him because they're already an over-the-cap team. And if they let him walk and they get that money off the books, it doesn't actually improve their salary cap situation all that much because they'll still be over the cap and would only have the mid-level exception to work with to sign other free agents to essentially replace him. And while yes, that is true, if the Bulls let DeMar walk, it's not like they suddenly get $28.6 million in cap space to sign another free agent since they're already well over the cap. This is the same situation with Nikola Vucevic. They kind of had to re-sign him because of the bird rights trap and that they wouldn't have added any cap space by letting him go. The difference here though is that just because the Bulls are capped out doesn't mean you need to just keep re-signing all of your veteran players because you wouldn't gain any cap space from it, especially if the team is not doing well and the player isn't going to be a part of your long-term plan, which DeMar at his age wouldn't be. So at some point, you have to draw a line in the sand and say, where are we going? And at what point in time are we finally going to be in a position to create cap space instead of just continuing to re-sign all of these guys because, well, we're over the cap and what better option do we have? Because at that point, you're just going to further perpetuate being in a constant state of being cap strapped because of the bird rights trap, and you're never going to get yourself out from underneath it. At what point, or with what player contract anyway, do you cut your losses and say, yeah, we're going to lose this player, we're not going to free up any cap space because of it, but we're heading in the right direction where we will actually be able to free up cap space to start making more impactful changes to this roster instead of just signing players to min deals or using the mid-level exception. So when people ask, well, what's the better option if we don't extend DeMar, given the circumstances of the Bulls cap situation, the better option is that you get closer to finally not overpaying for players who are getting past their primes just because you don't want to lose their precious bird rights to be able to use their salary to operate over the cap. The other thing, if you didn't extend DeMar, that I don't hear a lot of people talking about, how about the amount of tax space you would free up? Because sure, you would still be over the cap, but removing $28.6 million and not having that money count towards the luxury tax, which the Bulls are never going to pay, that enables you to free up space to actually use the full mid-level exception or other exception, since you wouldn't be pressed right up against the tax line as the Bulls currently are. And it enables you to offer an extension to someone like Patrick Williams, who again is also extension eligible to his rookie deal. Like, I know some people are already out on Pat, which is so premature, but I won't get into that now, especially since I already talked about it in a prior video. But if extending DeMar means you can't give Patrick Williams a good enough contract to where he potentially leaves, all because you don't have enough money to offer him a sizable deal before going into the tax, that is terrible in terms of how you're prioritizing this roster and its future. Now, the other thing I'll say is, I'm not opposed to the Bulls extending DeMar DeRozan. I'm really not, even though I know based on what I'm saying in this video would indicate otherwise. But I'm only for extending DeMar if, and only if, the Bulls start playing really well this season, say they're a top 4 team in the East and DeMar is still playing at a high level, but also impacting the game in more ways than just his scoring, whether it be through mentoring the younger guys, which he does, or elevating his passing, taking a step back and deferring to others on offense. If we see that from DeMar, and again, this is an in-season or even at the end of the season extension before free agency hits, then yeah, I'm fine with the Bulls extending DeMar on a short-term deal, maybe 2 years, and hopefully it's team-friendly. But extending DeMar now, this offseason, before we even see how this season takes shape, no, that would be a horrible decision. Because yes, DeMar is extension eligible right now. The Bulls can extend him at any point though during this season or even after the season, as long as it's before free agency, kind of like what the Bulls did with Vucevic this summer. To extend him now without seeing the overall makeup of this team, how he's going to fit, the shooting profile, how the team does in the standings, or whether he even suffers an injury, just doesn't make sense to me. Not when you have the ability to extend him anywhere between now and next June. With so many things uncertain as it relates to the Bulls offseason next year and potentially major changes coming next offseason, no, I'm sorry, but it just doesn't make sense. Now, as far as what I think will happen, I personally think the Bulls are most likely going to trade DeMar DeRozan at the deadline, or potentially even sooner, maybe even before training camp. They won't be able to trade him for much on an expiring deal, but he is still a high-level player. He can help a contending team in putting them over the hump as a second or third scoring option. And so you can get some assets for him rather than letting him walk for nothing in free agency. Or, and this is a very small chance, the Bulls actually extend him this offseason to a longer term deal, but then look to trade him for more value because he'll be on a longer term deal rather than an expiring contract. But I find that highly unlikely because there is also the possibility that teams will be wary of taking on a longer term contract for DeMar at his age. DeMar is also going to be looking to get paid. Say what you will about his game, doesn't fit in today's NBA, but the dude was still an all-star the last 2 seasons, putting up over 25 points per game between those 2 years, and doing so without having to take an exorbitant amount of threes. He's a very talented player, still one of the better players in the league, and he's going to want to get compensated for the value that he brings. The question is, will teams, specifically the Bulls, are they going to be willing to pay him that big contract that he's looking for? I personally don't think the Bulls will. I think they'll opt for a trade, but I would love to hear what you guys think. Let me know in the comments. As always, be sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.